Guns are an integral part of video games, with many of the biggest gaming franchises in the world putting the player behind a trigger. Ever since 1992's Wolfenstein 3D, the grandfather of the FPS genre, developers have tried to create weapons that balance realism, satisfaction, and various other considerations with what the technology of the time could achieve.
We can learn all about real-world bullets here at the Royal Armouries Museum, but how do weapon and bullet physics change between games? And how does that boss-slaying or round-winning shot go from here to here?
We all know how frequent the sight of a firearm is in our video games, little gun pun for you there, but how do they actually work in real life? Before I get into how games deliver their virtual lead to target, I spoke to Keeper of Firearms and Artillery at the Royal Armouries, Jonathan Ferguson, about the way that real bullets work and whether that has any impact on how they're portrayed in gaming.
So with a modern self-contained metallic cartridge, you have usually a brass case, sometimes steel, projectile pressed into the end, crimped into the end, the propellant is inside that case, and you have your percussion cap that used to be a separate item in the 19th century in the back of that case. That gives you all the ingredients you need to fire a gun. In fact, in many ways, that's the more important piece of technology than the gun itself, or as important, I should say. And then you just have to worry about how you get it in and out of the gun, because the whole thing has to go in, the case has to come out, and you have to get a whole new cartridge into the gun. In terms of firing sequence, a hammer or a striker, some pointy bit of metal hits that cap. It's a shock-sensitive compound in there, gives you your initial flash. Inside the cartridge case, the propellant starts to burn, and it generates a lot of pressure very quickly. You're looking at 35,000 pounds per square inch for 9mm parabellum, for example, roughly. That forces the bullet down the barrel. There's nowhere else the pressure can go. It's sealed shut. It's got to be held shut. Otherwise, you lose pressure out the back, and you might blow the gun up. You might blow yourself up. Bullet goes down, the barrel does what you need it to do.
Firing a virtual weapon and seeing its working parts move and operate are one of the details that I appreciate the most. And after working on Loadout and across the Firearms Expert React series, I find that I notice those details even more. Learning more about how real bullets work and how real weapons fire them allows us to look at games like Escape from Tarkov or Hot Dogs, Horseshoes and Hand Grenades with a deeper perspective, as those are titles that put a lot of attention into accurately recreating all of the motions a firearm goes through between pulling a virtual trigger and hearing a bang through your headset. It can be a double-edged sword though, and maybe you will now share my curse of noticing whether a virtual brass case is ejected towards the edge of your screen without a dimpled primer. But while inarguably cool, for the average gamer, these details matter much less than the simple cause and effect of firing your favorite virtual firearms. Video games and the guns within them are hugely varied, but the ways in which their shooting mechanics work can have a lot more in common, typically being hit-scan, projectile-based, or different hybrids of the two. The most common type of shooting mechanics is hit-scan. This technique uses technology similar to the one that first allowed 3D games to be developed, raycasting. Raycasting was used to render a three-dimensional scene into a two-dimensional image that could be displayed on your screen. Rays would be traced from the virtual eye of the player through each pixel in the virtual space, calculating things like the color and light of the object visible through it to ensure it is rendered correctly in the game world. The algorithm has a bunch of complex mathematics and geometry, but the calculations could be done relatively quickly, making it perfect for first-person shooter games, especially when computing power was fairly limited. Take Wolfenstein 3D for example. It's built from a square-based grid with walls being a uniform height. To render the world onto the screen, a ray is traced for each column of visible pixels. The algorithm can then scale each object to the correct size, depending on how long the ray takes to intersect or hit each object. Hit-scan weapons work in a very similar way to raycasting. In simplified terms, instead of a wide ray originating from the player's eye, a more narrow one will be cast to represent the weapon being fired. On the most basic level, it will determine where the weapon is being pointed and use that information to generate a ray, and then use the same raycasting ideas to determine if an object is hit. Usually, if your reticle is intersecting with your target when you fire, then a hit will be registered by the game engine, which will then enact the desired result, rendering damage on the environment or to an enemy, and initializing the correct sound effects and logic. The cause and effect of the player clicking their mouse or pulling a trigger and the bullet hitting a target all takes place instantly. And while that's obviously not how real-world weapons work, game designers use things like clever lighting, graphics, and sound to make the gunfire look and feel as realistic as possible. Depending on the game, more advanced ballistic properties can be applied, such as bullets ricocheting by programming rays to bounce off surfaces, or adding bullet penetration by allowing the ray to continue traveling through targets up to a set distance. Other methods used to mimic realism is to add random variables to the angle or placement of that ray that can then expand or change to give a sense of bullet spread or recoil. Hitscan allows a shooter to be a little more accessible to a wider audience, as you're not asking someone who just picked up your game to start learning bullet drop or lead times. Games using this method, like the classic Call of Duties, or story-driven shooters like Red Dead Redemption 2 and Half-Life, tend to have shooting mechanics with a more shallow learning curve. But Hitscan can also be a way to allow for instant gratification when utilizing your virtual armory. But there is another method that's a little more grounded in realism that many shooters use to create a more immersive experience. Games that want their simulated weapons to be as close as possible to their real-world counterparts are more likely to implement a physical projectile system. Rather than computing shots fired by detecting intersecting rays, a new object is spawned with each round fired by the player. This means bullets can have their own values and behavior. Each shot can have its own collision, mass, and velocity, with the potential of in-game systems influencing each individual bullet. Things like gravity and wind can start to affect the flight path of your lethal payload with this system, but it comes with the cost of requiring extra computing power. Since each object will need to have its own behavior and logic applied to it, the game engine, as well as the game's client and any multiplayer servers, must make use of both raw computing power and intelligent programming to ensure the game experience remains consistent. But newer game engines, advances in optimization and multiplayer networking, as well as hardware, makes a physics-based model much more accessible and more common than it used to be. Across the 2010s, Battlefield and Call of Duty would often be compared to one another, with Battlefield Bad Company 2 or BF3 offering players a more immersive combat experience or more realistic ballistics. And while they're both favourites of mine, even I can admit they're not the easiest for new players to get into. Video games, hardware, and player tastes have come a long way, especially in more recent years. And while changes in virtual bullets and ballistics reflect that, these changes have also proven to be necessary for game balance. While most of the franchise has historically used hitscan for the majority of their weapons, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2019 moved to a fully physics-based ballistic system, which made a lot of sense when you consider the other gameplay changes that were introduced. In the close quarters combat that has classically made up the majority of the more arcade-style Call of Duty multiplayer experience, the travel time of each round is almost imperceptible. But when you consider some of the larger maps or game modes that Modern Warfare 2019 introduced, a physics-based model became necessary. Imagine you're playing Ground War or Warzone, game modes where potential engagement distances are much larger. Now, if the weapons were instantaneous hit scan, avoiding snipers taking pot shots from nearby hills or rooftops would be incredibly difficult, and would no doubt be infuriating for players to combat. With these examples, it's clear why Call of Duty moved to a physics-based system, but doing so also raised the skill ceiling, as players would now need to learn new skills to hit those long-range shots. And it provided even more utility to the accessory and customization system that the game's gunsmith provided, letting players choose parts that could increase a bullet's velocity and travel time to target. The Battle Royale example isn't unique to Warzone though. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds was already using physics-based ballistics for similar reasons of balance, variety, customization options, and skill. But generally, most games that use this method will require players to at least account for things like bullet drop and leading targets, depending on the range in which they choose to engage. Bullet drop and travel time makes physics-based systems a necessity for milsims or any other titles that want to create realistic gameplay. Landing a long-range shot is one of the most satisfying things in games, and so bullet physics are a must-have for any title that wants to offer players the opportunity to live out their power fantasies of being a Special Forces sniper. Arma 3 offers an extremely detailed ballistic system, and Sniper Elite's ballistics is one of the franchise's biggest appeals, as their gameplay offers would-be marksmen the opportunity to authentically calculate bullet drop, lead time, and combat windage. But the core of a physics-based system itself can offer more functionality to developers who want to create moments of even deeper realism, authenticity, or immersion. Using a physical bullet means that you can add more properties to that object within a 3D space. For example, the sound of a round hitting an object nearby can change depending on the surface it hits or the distance between the player and the point of impact. In Ghost Recon Wildlands, bullets have a finite velocity and distance, with a wide array of weaponry all having unique stats, and if you are using a suppressed weapon with subsonic ammunition, then the time to impact your target is noticeably slower. As the bullets in Escape from Tarkov are physical entities that actually move through a player's weapon, it means there is also similar potential for authentic interaction with the detailed armor and hitbox system when it comes to armor penetration, ricochets, or a shot being able to sneak under your helmet into your head or eyes. One of the other details in Escape from Tarkov that still makes me leap from my seat is the sound of a bullet's supersonic crack as the shot whizzes by your ear after a lucky near miss. This can change depending on how far that physical bullet was from the player, if the virtual ammunition was supersonic or subsonic, and at longer distances or with suppressed weapons, that crack or slight whiz may be the only warning you get that someone is trying to take your hard-earned loot.
With both hit scan and physical ballistic systems in mind though, where your virtual bullets actually come from can also be hugely impactful to gameplay.
Bullets don't always originate from your gun. For simplicity, games will often have them coming out of the player's eye or the center of the screen, tracing an invisible line between the player's view and the position of the crosshair to register a hit, instead of the muzzle of the weapon model. However, if the player's view is tied to the player model's head, this can create an issue called head glitching, something that has been a source of frustration for FPS players for years.
This is because with this method, you're basically shooting out of your face, creating a huge advantage as you can fire from the safety of cover and enemy players have a much smaller target to hit.
One of the most extreme examples of this is in Team Fortress 2 with the Heavy's minigun. Despite them holding their weapon at waist height, the bullets are coming out of the player's eyes, creating moments where you can be flush up against cover with your large form protected, yet still able to fire away effectively. This can be somewhat rectified by games moving the camera and the bullet's point of origin lower to the chest or shoulder height, but this may also create a feeling of disconnect between the player's view and the world around them. But you obviously don't see the bullets coming out of your forehead or your crosshair. They look like they're coming out of your weapon, even when they aren't. The truth is, both with hit scan and physical ballistic systems, it's fairly common that the bullets or projectiles you see on your screen are purely cosmetic. Developers often add fake tracer rounds or objects that appear to be originating from the muzzle of the weapon model and moving through the game world, and the real important version that's being shot through the center of the player's view is invisible. This is all the more noticeable in games that use a physical system, as when close to a wall or object, it can appear that the cosmetic projectile is passing through those close obstacles. There are many games where a lot of work is put into disguising core weapon mechanics with flashy animations and effects. And by no means do I think that's a bad thing, as these are all efforts to ensure the weapons feel responsive and satisfying while communicating information to the player. But I do think that it's interesting that in a lot of titles, most of what you can see on your screen doesn't actually matter to the mechanics of the game. That in actuality, you're little more than an invisible floating camera with a hitbox. However, some games actually do use the muzzle of their virtual weaponry as the origin point for their bullets. While more authentic, it does mean that players need to be careful with their weapon placement, as regardless of your position, your shots will impact any object in front of your gun's barrel.
This can largely eliminate the issue of head glitching, as players will need to expose enough of their player model that their virtual gun can stick out.
But it can take a little getting used to, as it creates the issue of height over bore. Basically, the distance between your scope and barrel could mean that while your view is clear, the barrel a few inches lower is being blocked by a close object. Some games will also render a secondary crosshair on your HUD, one representing what you are aiming at and the other drawn on any close object that could block your shot. The inverse of this can be seen most obviously in Rainbow Six Siege, as the hit scan shots originate from the scope of the weapon while aiming. As due to the confined nature of the maps, this avoids any potential frustration of shots unexpectedly hitting the wall you're peeking out from.
But game designers don't have to stick with one technique or the other. In fact, these methods have frequently been merged together within the same game for various reasons in different ways for decades.
Take Fortnite for example. Prior to Chapter 5, most of the weapons were hit scan, which lends itself to a faster paced, close combat gameplay experience. That was except for weapons like sniper rifles, which used a projectile system, so that players who take the time to compensate for a moving target and bullet drop are rewarded with high damage attacks from a potentially safe range. Season 5 changed the game's ballistics, so now most of the weapons are projectile based to better work around the game's new attachment system. It's also common to see games that have weapons like rocket launchers and bows use a physics system for those, while the rest of the arsenal is hit scan. For example, in earlier Call of Duty titles, all of the firearms would be hit scan, but something like a grenade launcher or RPG that had a much slower and much more visible payload were projectiles. Even the original Doom mixed shot types when it came to specific weaponry, with the pistol, shotgun, and chain gun being hit scan and the plasma gun and rocket launcher spawning a simple projectile. Overwatch is another great example of this combined system, as Soldier 76's assault rifle is hit scan, but the Helix rocket he can also fire from it is physical. Heroes that use hit scan are also popular picks to counter others with high mobility, as they don't have to worry about leading their shots, just staying on target. Team Fortress 2 has weapons like the Scout's scattergun or the Sniper's rifle that spawns hit scan bullets from the player's eye, while also having bows and arrows that require a player to consider drop and lead time, as well as Soldier's rocket launcher that actually spawns a physical projectile from the weapon itself.
Godspeed, you magnificent bastard!
While the previous examples were games utilizing multiple systems across their arsenals, there are also hybrid systems that can exist within the gun itself. For example, in Rising Storm 2 Vietnam, firearms are hit scan and hit immediately within 25 to 50 meters, where calculating ballistics simply wouldn't matter. Instead, bullets will become physics-based should the shot need to travel further. This is a method that can reduce computing demands on a multiplayer server's load, while also offering the opportunity for more authentic long-ranged firefights. Insurgency Sandstorm has an interesting system where their physical bullets have power related to their velocity that decelerates over time, or if their bullet penetrates an object that either causes a round to slow down, with the velocity continuing to be calculated beyond that, or stop immediately. Their bullets are actually pre-simulated at close range, so a bullet travels instantly for 0.1 second, which mimics a hit scan system that feels more instant and gratifying, while still taking the negligible bullet drop into account, and then being followed by a live simulation that starts if that bullet has not been stopped within that 0.1 second. Insurgency Sandstorm's armor system works in a similar way to objects in terms of penetration, so that means that the game's physical bullets can more accurately represent the differences in damage done by a round shot into an armored opponent at close range versus one from far away that's had to punch through a wall or a car door. Rust also adopted a similar system during development. At close range, their guns are effectively hit scan, making close quarters gunplay more satisfying, but with trajectories being calculated beyond a certain distance depending on the weapon or ammunition. Using multiple systems or hybrids can help diversify a virtual arsenal, or even play into a game's storytelling or world building. Halo is an interesting example, as while its systems have changed across the franchise, for the most part, human weapons that fire bullets are either hit scan or projectile based with bullets that would travel instantaneously, so mostly felt hit scan, while most Covenant weapons are more obviously projectile based. This diversifies how the weapons of each faction feel when handled, further emphasizing their unique advantages or disadvantages, while also encouraging players to learn different playstyles or adapt to combat depending on what weapons are available. So many of these systems share similarities between games, but at the same time they are often tweaked, changed, and built upon so that a game's bullet mechanics work best for the game. And I think that's for the best, as it's more variety that the genre can offer. Sure, I love the satisfaction of leading a long-range shot into my target, but the instant gratification on clicking an enemy in Counter-Strike and immediately sending them to the spectator screen can be just as rewarding. But while the mechanics or combinations of systems a developer chooses will depend on their audience, the genre of the game, and the technical restrictions it's under, what's most interesting is that while shooters today look and play so vastly different to those from the PS1, N64, and even MS-DOS systems, they still have many of the same central mechanics at their core. These are mechanics that have been refined and improved over time, sure, but fundamentally remain largely unchanged. But you know what they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Thank you so much for watching this week's episode of Loadout. I hope you enjoyed this dive into the mechanics that make your virtual weaponry tick, and now you have a better idea on just how the enemy keep mowing you down. What do you prefer, the instant gratification of hit scan, or taking the time to learn the physics system in your FPS of choice? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, or find me on social media at IrregularDave. Make sure to subscribe for more episodes of Loadout, check out our previous episodes, and thank you for watching.